Ladies and gentlemen, please stand in for the drummer and the head table.
Good evening. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the British United Services Club of Los Angeles, founded in 1935. Tonight is Navy Night, commemorating the Battle of Trafalgar. Now that we have your attention, tonight we'll start the evening off with two prayers recited by our chaplain, Basil C. Johnson, Esquire. Basil? Yes. Cheer up, my lads, to each of glory we steer, to add something more to this wonderful year. To honor we call you as free men, not slaves, for who are so free as the sons of the waves. Heart of oak are our ships, jolly tars are our men. We always are ready, steady, boys, steady. We'll fight and we'll conquer again and again. We ne'er see our foes, but we wish them to stay. They never see us, but they wish us away. If they run, why we follow and run them ashore. For if they won't fight us, what can we do more? Heart of oak are our ships, jolly tars are our men. We always are ready, steady, boys, steady. Go ahead and we'll conquer again and again. We still make them feel and we still make them flee, and drub them ashore as we drub them at sea. Then cheer up, me lads, with one heart let us sing. Our soldiers and sailors, our statesmen and king. Heart of oak are our ships, jolly tars are our men. We always are ready, steady, boys, steady. We'll fight and we'll conquer again and again. More than 2 decades, he was a partner at Duane Morris LLP, an international firm headquartered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and for 13 years taught as a professor at the Marshall Wythe Law School of the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. He also taught as a visiting professor at the law schools of Penn State University, the University of San Diego, and the University of Richmond. Don is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and the Law School of the University of California in Berkeley. At Texas, he began a 50-year fascination and study of the life of Admiral Horatio Nelson, which is culminated in this book, I, Horatio. And I have it on authority from Ian Scone-Rees himself, who diligently read the book and is excited by it, that it's a terrific read, and we commend it to you, I, Horatio, by Donald Tortorice. It is a book that is written really, it's unique. It's really the first presentation of Lord Nelson to be narrated in the first person. It's a recounting of Lord Nelson's life in his own words, and begins with Lord Nelson as a 21-year-old captain in the Caribbean and goes to his death at the Battle of Trafalgar. Along the way, his experiences in carrying out the vision of his duty in the Caribbean, Corsica, Tenerife, the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, the Nile, Copenhagen, and Trafalgar cost him his eye, his right arm, and ultimately his life, all because he was blessed and cursed with a nature that was blind to the specter of failure and deaf to anything other than the call of duty, the clamor of battle and victory. He was also a mortal man whose attraction to women brought pleasure, frustration, infatuation, and ultimately lifelong satisfaction. Yeah. I, Horatio, is the story of Lord Nelson as he would tell it in the first person. And again, we commend it to you. But in between writing I, Horatio, before that rather, our speaker, Don Tortorice, is the author of The Modern Rules of Order and several law texts in the field of health law and bioethics. Prior to law school, he served for 5 years as a United States naval officer, serving initially aboard a destroyer, the USS John W. Thomason in the Pacific. And in 1966 to 67, he commanded a swift boat in Vietnam, where he was awarded the Individual Cross of Gallantry by the Republic of South Vietnam. He completed his naval career as an assistant professor of naval science at Yale University. He currently resides in Pinehurst, North Carolina, where he plays golf, reads, writes, and travels frequently to visit members of his family in San Diego. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's presentation, Horatio Lord Nelson, Some Frustrations and Defeats. Don Tortorice.
That's what I'm going to talk about. Lord Horatio Nelson, Some Frustrations and Defeats. You know, when Ian and I first talked about my coming and talking with you tonight, he suggested that I correlate the essence of Nelson's character with influences on his life. And I thought, well, that would be a challenge. Let's see, what are the distilled essences of his character? He was aggressive. He was intensely ambitious. He was competent. He was inspiring, and he was horny. Now, if this were an open mess night where all of your spouses would be here, I would probably say sensual. But you know that to be horny is sensual to the third power, and that's what Nelson was. Now, I considered his childhood. He lost his mother before he was age 10. He was raised by a distant and non-nurturing father who was a minister in the Church of England, who had no real effect on him. He was brought into the Navy at age 12 by his uncle Maurice Suckling, who never really had any kind of long-standing relationship with him. He served under a lot of disparate senior officers, but none stands out as being particularly effective in molding his character. So why was he aggressive, ambitious, competent, inspiring, and horny? I was at a loss to say, but if this had been an open mess night and your spouses had been here, they probably at this point would be rolling their eyes and wanting to lean forward and say, he was English. And it was in his DNA, you know. It just. So I told Ian, I can't do that. I can't relate any of that stuff. And I also thought, really not knowing how few Brits there were and how many Americans and others there would be in the audience, I said, I'm not going to talk about the Battle of Cape St. Vincent or the Nile or Copenhagen or Trafalgar because it's known to Brits. Had I known there'd be so many Americans here, I'd have talked about those things. But I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to talk about things that are rather innocuous to the life of Horatio Nelson, and that is some of his defeats and his frustrations. And there are 6 episodes that I'm going to talk about. So as you plot your way through this, I'll tell you which number episode I'm on so you'll know where we are. Number 1, in Nicaragua. Nelson at the time, and the year was 1780, he was in command of the HMS Hinchinbrook. He was a captain of a ship of the line at age 22. Amazing by today's standards. At the time, the Spanish Empire was faltering, largely because it was disparate, it was distant, and it wasn't administered appropriately. And they should invade and take control of the Spanish territory of Nicaragua. And so he put together an army under the command of a Major Polson and said, Horatio Nelson, we'd like you to escort and land this army in Nicaragua and then ferry reinforcements back and forth as necessary while they take this country to be inculcated within the British Empire. Nelson takes the army to Nicaragua. Once they are there and they are disembarking, he realizes that these are people who are about to take a country away from Spain to the glory of Britain. And he realizes, I cannot be passive during this time. I have to be part of that attack force. So he gathers together all of his Marines and a number of his gunners and bosun's mates and asks them, would you like to join this force? They all respond in the positive because they are Brits, and it's a time when the empire is glowing. So they join with Colonel Polson, and they start up the San Juan River. It is told that everything is going to be wonderful, dry, and commodious with respect to traveling up the river, and you can even travel in the river. But they didn't realize that it was not the dry season, it was the bloody wet season. So it took 7 weeks to get from where they were going to their first objective. 7 weeks slogging through mucky jungle with mosquitoes buzzing around them all the time, imparting malarial bacteria to them, snakes dangling from limbs and all over the grounds. One of the seamen was bitten near the eye by a snake and died within an hour. Another went to relieve himself in the bushes and was mangled by a jaguar. 7 weeks it took for them to get up close to their objective. And they ran into an outpost before the Castillo de San Juan. And if you look closely in that portrait to the right of Nelson, there is a structure, and that is the Castillo San Juan. That was their objective. But they come to an outpost, and it's an outpost of about 40 soldiers, Spanish soldiers, who were an early warning for the Castillo. Nelson sees an opportunity, and so he goes to Colonel Polson and he says, Colonel, let me and my Marines and seamen, let us take that outpost. In the meantime, why don't you take your forces and go around behind them to prevent any kind of retreat, and if we should fail, you can attack them from behind. To Polson, this is a very appealing suggestion because if this supposedly ragtag group of Marines and sailors under Nelson should fail, well then I can attack and I can take this relatively small outpost. And with no loss to my force, it's only a loss to Nelson and his force. Well, Nelson and his Marines and seamen attack at dawn. after Polson has gone to the back. And they attack with such a fury that as they approach, moving along the ramparts before the fortress, the Spaniards drop their weapons and start to flee. In the meantime, Polson's force comes forward, levels their guns at the Spaniards, and they retire. Victory. Victory for Nelson and his small force, showing his initiative, his fearlessness, and his willing to lead from the front. In the meantime, however, as they move up the river to lay siege to the Castillo San Juan, the major fort protecting Nicaragua, everybody in the force becomes ill, largely due to malaria from the mosquitoes that have been feeding on them for the past 6 weeks, and jungle fever having to do with bacteria. Nelson also becomes ill, bedridden, entirely incapable of any kind of effective action. In the meantime, however, orders arrive saying that he is to be taken command of a new ship, a larger ship, the HMS Janus. Polson then, pursuant to those orders, sends him back down the river together with the remainder of his Marines and seamen. Probably saves his life, one of the 5 times when he should have died but did not. He goes back down the San Juan River and goes to a ship, the HMS Hinchinbrook, which is under the command of his first lieutenant, whose name is Cuthbert Collingwood, who will be a very major player in the Battle of Trafalgar, leading the second column of attack. And they are lifelong friends and colleagues. Nelson arrives. He is deathly ill, still cannot take command of the HMS Janus, and instead is sent to Jamaica, where he recuperates under the care of a mulatto slave-freed mistress of the governor of Jamaica, and is brought back to life, still having a lot of angst about whether or not the defeat in Nicaragua will be attributed in any way to him, because it is a defeat of the 1,800 men who attack the Castillo San Juan. Fewer than 1,200 remain to be serviceable within 6 months after the attack. However, Colonel Polson, having observed Nelson throughout the entire campaign, writes the following of him. The totalities of Captain Nelson and his efforts were exemplary. Words are hard to find what express that which I owe to that young officer of his contributions to the expedition. A defeat, but Nelson is left unscathed, untouched by the defeat because of what he did and because of the honest report of his senior officer. All right, number 2. An acute eye for women. After Nicaragua, he goes back home to England and is assigned to escort a convoy from Portsmouth to Quebec. He does that, and at Quebec he meets an individual who will be a lifelong friend and a factor of all of his prizes, a fellow named Alexander Davison. Davison in Quebec introduces him at a governor's ball to the daughter of the Provost General of Quebec, and her name is Mary Simpson. She's lovely. Nelson has an eye for that which is lovely, and after a couple of meetings and then having tea with her a number of times at the governor's mansion, he falls in love with her. Tip says, wait, before I leave, I want to go and I want to propose to Mary Simpson. I want to ask her to marry me. So he leaves his ship, the HMS Albemarle, goes to the dock, and there he finds his old friend Alexander Davison, who has introduced him to Mary, and Davison makes a chronology of what happens on the dock. Davison, pray Horatio, why are you here? Nelson, I have come back to speak with Miss Simpson. I find it utterly impossible to leave this place without laying myself and my fortunes at her feet. I desire that she become a part of my future and my world. Davison, Horatio, that would be your ruin, situated as you are. Nelson, then let it follow, for I am resolved to do it. He was also very hard-headed. Davison, and I positively declare that you will not do it. Nelson, a life without her at my side will be worth whatever the price has to be paid. Davison, no, Horatio, you do not understand the way things stand. Nelson, I understand only that I love her. Besotted. Davison, you and a score of other men in Quebec. The young woman has attracted every young man of standing in this city. There are suitors who would line up at her door who believe that she is a perfect object of their future lives, and know this. She is quite friendly and has been for some time with a Captain Matthews who has asked for her hand. And she has confided that when he is promoted to major, hello all those majors out there, she will accept his engagement to marry. Davison then took Nelson firmly by the shoulders, turned him toward his ship and said, Horatio, look, this is your future. My young, besotted friend, do not abandon it. Nelson is struck to the core by Davison's work, and he reflects that my emotion for desire for Miss Simpson was suddenly overcome by the facts that Davison recited. It was an obvious truth, and it was wisdom spoken by a friend. Nelson paused and told Davison, thank you, I believe you. He returns to the Albemarle and takes the convoy to New York for defense of the crown against those obstreperous Americans. All right. After the American Revolution ends and the Treaty of Paris is signed and America becomes America and there is peace, Nelson goes on leave at half pay. And he and a friend, James McNamara, where is Major McNamara? Yes. Perhaps your forebear, James McNamara, and he go to France because Nelson thinks he wants to learn French better and wants to understand the French better and the depths of their degradation. But in any event, he and McNamara go to France. McNamara was a frigate captain in the Caribbean under Nelson and was a bon vivant and a fellow who was never lost at exploiting an opportunity. In France, they have what is called many dalliances, and one of those dalliances is described in the book through the license of historical fiction, but it's a lot of fun to write. Anyway, they finally get to Saint-Omer, where they meet up with an English minister of the Church of England who is on holiday with his family. And within his family, there is a lovely young woman named Elizabeth Andrews, and that's a picture of Elizabeth Andrews. Nelson falls in love with her, of course. I mean, she's a lovely young woman, and lovely young women are there to fall in love with and to prosecute whatever opportunities there might be available. It's to his uncle, Maurice Suckling, Captain and then Admiral Maurice Suckling, for money in order to present himself to be a potential husband for Elizabeth Andrews. And, oh, horror of horrors, she turns him down. She says, no, I don't want to marry you, for whatever reason. So he goes back to England, his head down, his tail between his legs. But when he gets back to England, he enters into an epoch that his brother Maurice describes as my brother Horatio running at the ring of pleasure, which involves a number of young lovelies. A young married woman to a member of the British Foreign Service who happened to be away from home for a long time. And so Nelson apparently filled that void. And we don't know her name, but we get this from Nelson's journal. Quote, "Our last activity together was a horseback ride, during which my horse bolted out of control and ran through the common past London Gate, where I encountered a wagon on a narrow street. My horse could hardly pass. To save my legs and perhaps my life, I was obliged to throw myself from the horse, which I did with great agility, but unluckily upon hard stones, which hurt my back and leg, but caused no other mischief. It was 1,000 to 1 that I had not been killed. For several weeks thereafter, I walked with a limp, but I confess also with a self-satisfied and rich memory. I did not feel guilty. Perhaps I should have. I did not." That was Nelson running at the Ring of Pleasure. Number 3, judgment on behalf of Nelson, which shows that he was human and capable of making mistakes. Now, Prince William Henry, the younger son of George III, was sent to sea in order to get him out of the negative influences of his older brother, the Prince of Wales, who later would become, of course, King George IV. Now, in the Royal Navy, Prince William Henry advanced rather rapidly, faster than his contemporaries. Oh, what a surprise. And was given command of a ship. Whether or not he should have been given command is an open question, to actually run the ship. And it appointed a splendid young officer named Isaac Schomburg, who was to serve as first lieutenant under Captain William Henry. Captain, Your Highness, William Henry. The ship was USS Pegasus. And Captain Royal Highness William Henry got to be at odds with all the officers of his ship, all of them, and especially Isaac Schomburg. And it all sort of came to a head over a situation in which Schomburg, before the ship was to get underway the next morning, sent a boat to retrieve members of the crew who were still ashore. Prince Captain William Henry then dressed him down, as he often did, even in public, in the presence of other officers and even enlisted men, would dress his first lieutenant down and said, "I have issued an order that no boat of the ship shall be used and shall do anything without my express permission." Schomburg replied that he had not heard the captain say this. It was not in the orders of the day. It was not in the ship's orders. And it wasn't in the log or the journal. Nevertheless, Captain Prince William Henry said, "I did issue it, and I am going to write out an official rebuke for you that will go into your service jacket." Schomburg was upset by this and did the only thing that he could do, and that was to go to the next senior commander, Horatio Nelson, and request a court-martial. When he did this, Nelson, realizing that he had to make a choice between equity and right and loyalty to the prince, chose the latter. And he said, "Schomburg, I am now issuing an order that no one will request a court-martial that is trivial. Pursuant to this order, I therefore place you under arrest and confine you to your ship to be court-martialed for breach of this order that I have just rendered," even though the order was not in existence when Schomburg walked into his cabin. So, in the meantime, Prince William Henry goes back to England. He's finished his Caribbean tour. And Nelson still has the issue of Schomburg's court-martial. He doesn't want to confront it, and so what he does is sort of skate off to the side and refer it to Admiral Alan Gardner in Jamaica, who is the governor of the Caribbean, and says, I don't have enough officers to convene a court-martial. You do, you take care of it. Gardner called together all of the officers from the HMS Pegasus, none of whom had ever heard of or seen or knew of any such order that Schomburg was accused of having breached. Gardner dismissed the court-martial, but ordered Schomburg to write a written apology to the prince. He did so. The prince rejected it, and thereafter held a great resentment toward Alan Gardner for all of Gardner's career, but not Nelson, because Nelson had escaped the spotlight. It's interesting that while Prince William Henry was the captain of the Pegasus, he issued two orders. One was that the enlisted men were not, after washing their clothes, were not to hold them, were not to hang them out to dry above decks or below decks. Where he wanted them to dry remains a mystery to this day. I have no idea. He also issued an order that forbade the use of the word bugger by any enlisted man. And for any captain to think that they can issue an order that will govern the language of seamen is about like issuing an order against the wind. It just won't have any effect. And Prince William Henry's sensitivity to language, like the horrific word bugger, is kind of interesting, considering a letter that is found in the archives of King William the Fourth, no, King George the Fourth, which reads as follows, and this is a letter from Prince William Henry when he is in Germany to his brother. Oh, for England and the pretty girls of Westminster, at least, as would not clap me or pox me every time I fucked. He was not particularly sensitive to language. And there's another letter in the same archives that describe in detail his having relations with a woman of color of a town in the Caribbean against a wall of that town in the Caribbean. And for those of you who want to research King William the Fourth's archives, when you go to the Royal Archives, you won't find any. Why? Because during his reign, he ordered that they all be burned. They were. Maybe a wise decision. And these letters are within the archives of his brother, King George the Fourth. And of course, considering the sensitivity of social propriety, we know that King William IV, Prince William Henry, had no heirs, notwithstanding that he had 10 illegitimate children with his mistress, the actress Barbara Jordan. And as having no heirs at the time of his death led to the coronation of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria. All right, number 4, Tenerife. Admiral Jervis, Lord St. Vincent, victor at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, finds out that there is information relating to a Spanish galleon that is proceeding from Manila back to Madrid that is due to land in the Canary Islands at Tenerife, and he wants to capture the galleon and all of the gold on board. Puts Nelson in command of an attack force to capture the island of, the island of Tenerife and the city of San Juan, and to wait for the galleon to arrive with all of its gold. An established defensive position commanded by General Antonio Gutierrez, a brilliant Spanish general, with 1,700 men. No attacks. The first is the sending of an attack force ashore from the 7 frigates with about 900 men. What they didn't realize was that there was going to be a great north to south current and very heavy waves before the shore. The boats all crash. And in the crashing, the scaling ladders that were supposed to be used to breach the walls of the fort are all lost. The force retreats. On the second day, the squadron goes closer in to make bombardment of the forts, but because of the uneven basis for their firing due to heavy seas, they are ineffective. They nevertheless send boats ashore, which, because of withering fire from the fort and from the other batteries, has to be repulsed and returns to their ships. The third day and final approach is one which Nelson decides has to be the defining attack, and one that he will lead himself. He does. It's supposed to take place at the break of dawn on the third day. He takes the ships before first light, close to shore, and they are within 100 yards of the shore when all of a sudden the Spanish find out that they are there. The alarm sounds, and fire begins to be emitted from all of the batteries and from the fort on shore. Nelson is struck. He is struck just above the elbow of his right arm, tearing essentially the remnants of the arm only held by loose flesh from his body. His stepson, Josiah Nesbitt, takes off one of his stockings, makes a tournament, and stanches the bleeding, probably saving his life the second of 5 times when he should have probably been died. He's taken back to his flagship. The landing force is recalled. He scrawls out a report of the defeat to Admiral Jervis for the first time using his left hand. And interestingly enough, the defeat, which is a very clearly defined disastrous defeat, is not recorded, is not felt as being defeat because of the heroic measures that Nelson and Trowbridge and Fremantle and others of his captains did in making the attack. And in fact, Admiral Jervis writes the following to Nelson: "My dear Horatio, mortals cannot command success. You and your companions have certainly deserved it. By the greatest of heroism and perseverance that was ever exhibited, I salute you." A defeat becomes essentially a moral victory for him. Number 5, marriage to Fanny. Kind of sensual ardor that he has, meets Frances Fanny Nesbitt, a young widow with a young son by her first husband, an older man who died because of a tropical disease. Now, Fanny is the niece of the president of the Council of Nevis, the head of the island of Nevis, which is the most important British island in the Caribbean. And she, in fact, acts as his hostess for all of the events that takes place at the governor's mansion called Montpelier. Nelson and Fanny meet. They become entranced with one another, and their courtship bespeaks what might be a perfect marriage. An enduring courtship follows. Nelson and Nesbitt are married at Montpelier Estate in 1787, with Prince William Henry giving the bride away. Now, why did Prince William Henry give the bride away instead of her uncle, the Governor General of Nevis? Well, because he said he wanted to, and so he did. On the beach. Nelson and Fanny Nesbitt are together for that 5 years. No children are produced for that 5 years. And thereafter, Nelson will refer to his wife Fanny as my wife by whom I have no children. And no one really knows what the disengagement was, but it was quite likely what George Washington wrote about his wife Martha in saying that there was very little excitement between their sheets. She also was just not she was not suited to be Nelson's wife. She did not praise him. His vanity needed praise. She wrote about trivial matters and was never really concerned with what he was doing and the remarkably disastrous kind of potential situations in which he voluntarily thrust himself. She even criticized his heroics. She told him after the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, do not lead any more boardings. Let the captains do that, without realizing that Nelson didn't choose to do that. He had to do that. She was inattentive. She did not pack his locker well. She left out things that he had asked for. She left out things that he needed. She complained constantly about the cold of England, about the drafts at their home in Burnhamthorpe, about the price of food, about her inability to find the right gloves, about all the things that meant nothing to him. And really her inattentiveness and her non-responsiveness set the stage for being eclipsed by another woman. And that, steady lad. Emma was the daughter of a blacksmith. But at an early age, she gravitated toward noble service as a nursemaid and then as a maid to local actresses. She came to the notice of Sir Harry Featherstone Hall, who took her as a mistress, and by whom she became pregnant at age 15. She was discarded immediately by Featherstone Hall, but was taken up by his friend, Sir Charles Greville, the second son of the Earl of Warwick, who kept her for 2 years as his mistress. Next one, Ian. This is another portrait that Romney did. And in all, he did more than 100 portraits of Emma at the time when she was the mistress of Charles Greville. Was the mistress of Featherstone Hall and then Charles Greville, his friend, who described her as the best bedmate he had ever had. She was also obviously a very attractive young woman. Greville, however, had no money, and so he decided Hamilton, the British minister to the kingdom of the two cities, of the two Sicilies. She goes to the kingdom of the two Sicilies as the mistress, essentially, to Sir William Hamilton. She defines herself and demonstrates an ability to be companionable, intelligent, adaptive, and circumspect. And in fact, while she is there, she shows herself to be capable of becoming his wife because she has acculturated herself to the position, and he marries her. After the marriage, she becomes ensconced within the kingdom of the two Sicilies and becomes a confidant and perhaps the greatest advisor to the person who rules the kingdom of the two Sicilies, Queen Carolina, who was the daughter of Empress Maria of Austria and the sister to Marie Antoinette of France. So, Emma Hamilton is an accomplished person in Naples after the Battle of the Nile, when Nelson defeats and isolates defeats the French fleet, destroys it, isolates Napoleon in Egypt and becomes the hero of all of free Europe, and especially the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which was very fearful of being overrun by Napoleon. And when Nelson goes back to Naples after the Nile, after his great victory, as a hero to all of Europe with a head wound, he meets again and is treated by Emma, who looks like this. Yeah, that's what I would say the full bloom of womanhood, or quite a dish. Take your pick. I mean, it's one of the and what happens is that she becomes everything that Nelson needs. She praises him. She tends to him. She caresses him. And he is praiseworthy, receptive of attention, and loves the touch of that woman. The two fall in love deeply and passionately and tactilely in love. But of course she has her husband. And her husband is, hold on, steady lad. That was then when 67 was old, unlike today, when 67 is just reaching your pace before you reach your prime at 70, right? But he was, that was then, and I think that he, for whatever reason, the relationship between Emma and Horatio was one that he not only accepted as a mari complaisant, but perhaps even encouraged. And in fact, with respect to the relationship that existed between the three of them, he called it a trio in uno junto, three in one joined. He remained the close friend of Horatio Nelson, and Nelson a friend of him throughout their lives until his very death. During their romantic episode, Emma becomes pregnant with their child, who is born and named Horatia, and thereafter has at least one other child. And the accounts as to the second child are conflicting. Some say it was another daughter that was born. Other accounts say it was twins that were born. But in any event, there's no record of either a single or double child surviving. Now, their affair, I mean, notwithstanding the fact that the Prince of Wales, who became King George IV, and Prince William Henry, who became Prince William IV, had scores of affairs. The relationship between Nelson and Emma Hamilton was the scandal of London. It would have ended his career had it not been for Admiral Jervis and his being First Lord of the Admiralty, who realized what Nelson was to the Royal Navy and what he could do by virtue of his leadership. He appointed Nelson to command the attack squadron at the Battle of Copenhagen, where Nelson engaged the Danish fleet, and upon being given the order to withdraw by Admiral Parker offshore, lifted his telescope to his blind eye and said, "I see no such order," continues the battle, takes the surrender of Copenhagen out to the admiral who had told him to withdraw. And then, of course, at Trafalgar, where he puts together a winning team that has won the battle long before the first shot is fired. Takes his two columns, cuts the French and Spanish fleet in half, takes every ship available, loses no British ship. And before the battle, writes out his will in which he says, I leave Lady Hamilton and my daughter Horatia as a legacy to my country. And before he dies, and immediately before he utters his last words, thank God I have done my duty, he tells Chaplain Scott, please remember that I leave Lady Hamilton and my daughter as a legacy to my country. The final frustration, the final tragedy is that this is entirely disregarded by Great Britain. And the woman whom he loved so intently, so completely, spends time in debtor's prison, finally escapes Britain and goes to Calais in order to avoid her debtors, actually her creditors. And there with their daughter Horatia, dies in poverty, ironically in France. And the greatest admiral Great Britain has ever known has as his legacy really two things. One is to be buried in this magnificent vault in St. Paul's Cathedral, and the second is to have his last dying hope to his country to be totally disregarded. Interesting twist of history. Thank you all.
Ask for a few questions. Sure. I think we have time for a few questions, if there are any questions of Don.
Ian.